we write about contraception, we write about sex, we write about, what
so
will...
light, fun.
Light, fun, and then towards the end of the edition, sometimes we sneak in something like the impact of, Antonin Scalia dying.
Right, just
throw that in.
So it's like orgasms than Antonin Scalia's death.
Well, actually, Antonin Scalia would have preferred it if none of us had orgasmed.
Yes, that's true, that's a fair point.
The thing I'm most fascinated about is porn and virtual reality, actually.
Right, okay.
Because it really looks like men are never, ever going to have to leave their men caves.
Right, ever.
It's really worrying. Worrying if you think that sex is actually a good thing, and preferably sex with a real person as opposed to an invented person.
Right.
But I think, the sort of, I don't know how many of you are aware of the Fleshlight, which is a masturbatory tool for men. And it's like a sort of padded thermos that you put your penis in.
Right.
And actually what you can, they exist now, but they're going to have so much more appeal, I think, to a certain kind of man once they've got those big plastic Oculus Rift things on.
I'm just thinking of that for a second. But that's a great Cosmo story, right?
Yeah, it is a great Cosmo story. How do you prize how do you prize this off your boyfriend's head and get him to face you in real life?
Anything else that you think is important as a media executive to use?
Well, the thing I find really interesting, and I don't know how much you're talking about it at Recode, but when I was looking down the program, I didn't see much on it, is how much of the, 30% of internet usage is spent, or 30% of internet time on the internet is spent on porn.
Porn again.
And I find it, I know I always come back to porn, but I find it an incredibly interesting statistic.
We had a lot of porn last year. We had more porn last year.
I find it really interesting that we're not having a conversation as a culture about how it's impacting us, because I really do think it's impacting people's
Well, explain. Let's finish up on porn.
Well, I think
why not?
If your default learning experience of sex as a young, as someone from the age of sort of 10 onwards, is looking at Pornhub or looking at YouPorn or whatever you're looking at, it radically changes your expectation of what sex is and what sex is going to be and what the opposite sex or the same sex is going to want from you in the bedroom. And I think it's really interesting that as a culture we don't really talk about it. And I think about this through the prism of Cosmo, because we talk about this a lot. Women haven't figured out yet whether or not they want to do the things that men feel obligated to ask them because what they have seen on porn. And one of the things, for example, is men wanting to come on women's faces, orgasm on women's faces. And we get a lot of letters from readers saying, he wants to come on my face, I don't feel good about this, can you suggest an alternative?
I have never gotten that letter at Recode yet.
Well, perhaps we could all start sending those letters to Recode. But so I find this is the stuff that I find, not which tech giant is interesting or whatever.
Yeah.
What I find this kind of stuff, how does this impact our behavior in the bedroom, really interesting. And, if you're a 17-year-old boy and you're having sex for the first time, you're a 15-year-old girl, and someone is trying to do this, is this a good thing? Do you feel good about this? Is this exciting? How do you say no? And I think when your default learning position about sex, because American sex education is so poor, and it's a fascinating statistic, in only 13 states in America does learning about sex education and how babies are born actually have to be medically accurate, which is such an extraordinary statement. Only 13 states require it to be medically accurate. So where does that leave kids? As we're having this conversation, I'm thinking there should be a Cosmo sex position called the Swisher. Oh. And I'm just wondering what it would involve.
That's an interesting question. Yeah.
I'm figuring it out.
Some version of the wheelbarrow is fine.